Thank you. Good evening. I asked if we could make the lighting a little more romantic. I hope that works for you. I want to begin by just saying a quick word of thanks to Furman and Ole and to the Riley Institute. It is a real treat to be here, an honor to be here in this room, and such a special thing, this summer series that they put on. What an asset to the community. And I want to say a word of thanks to you as well for taking time out this evening to come and join us in this conversation, which I consider to be maybe the most important public policy conversation we can be having in South Carolina, and that is the question of how we are going to support the roughly 336,000 young children under the age of 5 in South Carolina. Now, I know that I will be preaching to the choir, as it were, in this room when I tell you, as a South Carolinian, I am frustrated, as I'm sure you are, by seeing so often the state of South Carolina listed at the bottom of the lists that we know we need to be aspiring to be at the top of. Susan mentioned in some cases we're at the top of lists that we know we don't want to be at the top of. So if we could sort our lists out, that would be great. But one of the good news stories that I want to tell you tonight is that that is not the case for early childhood education. South Carolina actually has a very progressive, a very forward-thinking approach to early childhood education, which is so important. And I want to share a little bit this evening about some of the major policy investments that South Carolina has made in young children. If you follow education news at all, you might be aware that over the past couple of years in particular, there has been a lot of conversation about the expansion of 4-year-old kindergarten or pre-K, pre-kindergarten, not only in South Carolina, where we have expanded a fair amount, but really across the country. Legislatures from coast to coast have added here over just even the past couple of years, hundreds of millions of dollars in expansion of 4-year-old pre-kindergarten. One of the things you may not know, though, that is really saying something special about South Carolina's 4-year-old kindergarten program is actually celebrating this year its 32nd birthday. Take a moment and soak that in about South Carolina. It really is something special, and I will tell you, I mentioned this in part. Let's see if I can, here we go. I mention this in part because it is the first of a number of policy innovations that I want to make sure that you are aware of that relate to early childhood education. But I think it's especially fitting in this room, in this context, that we begin with 4-year-old kindergarten, because it was begun under the leadership of a visionary governor whose name happens to be on the podium in front of me. And it is a shame that Governor Riley wasn't able to be here tonight so that we could all thank him together for his vision. But just as a little bit of an indication, you can see on this slide as to how forward-thinking Governor Riley was in that sense to get a statewide pre-kindergarten program going in 1984. That was 12 years before the state committed to full-day 5-year-old kindergarten. So the first pre-K programs in South Carolina were created as part of the Education Improvement Act, which you may know is a 1-cent sales tax that you probably contributed to today already. It continues to fund throughout the state pre-kindergarten and a whole list of important educational programs. It is a dedicated source of funding for education. It's not the only source of education funding, but certainly a dedicated one in South Carolina. And that is, so as early as 1984, we had a statewide presence. It was a relatively small scale program, but certainly happening in every school district. We began phasing in full-day 5-year-old kindergarten in 1996 over a 3-year period. In 1999, I'm very excited to say that I was there for part of this and still there. South Carolina First Steps to School Readiness was created. We are the state's comprehensive early childhood education initiative, and I will talk a little bit about the kinds of programs that we fund a little bit later on here as we go. In 2005, you may know there was already a reference earlier this evening to the Abbeville court case. This is the school equity funding lawsuit that has been going on in South Carolina now for more than 20 years. A group of 37 rural school districts brought suit against the state of South Carolina Carolina, claiming that it was unconstitutional the way that we fund public education, particularly in these rural communities where they lack an industry base and a revenue base. That case was partially settled in 2005. Circuit Court Judge Thomas Cooper ruled against initially the school districts at that point, but what he said was that the state was not fulfilling its constitutional obligation, in particular to young children in poverty. And so two things happened as a result of that during the 2006 legislative session. One was that First Steps was reauthorized, and the other was the creation of a really innovative new approach to four-year-old kindergarten in both the public and the private sectors. You probably know that the years of early childhood have not traditionally been the realm of school districts, right? That for very young children, it's been churches and private preschools and families that have really provided those services. And so when the General Assembly sought to expand four-year-old kindergarten through what they called the Child Development Education Pilot Program, CDEP, they chose to do it in both public school settings through the Department of Education and in a series of private preschools around the state. We currently run that in about 200 private preschool providers around the state through First Steps. So we have been proud to co-administer that program. In 2014, we were reauthorized once more, and then the other thing that is important there in 2014 was the Read to Succeed Act. You may have heard of this. Read to Succeed is a third grade reading proficiency bill, and many states, particularly in the Southeast, have moved in this direction, where children who are not reading proficiently by the third grade stand the chance of being retained in a grade level if they are not reading proficiently by that point. One of the sort of legislative compromises in that conversation was, if we're going to talk about retaining children in the third grade, then we need to make sure before they get to the third grade that we have given them every opportunity not to be retained. And so one of the things that happened as part of Read to Succeed was that CDEP, that 4K pilot program in the public and private sectors, after 8 years, was formally codified into law. And so now it is very nearly the law all across the state. I will tell you, you may know, Greenville County is one of the remaining districts. We are currently in 64 of 81 school districts in the state. Those that are remaining tend to be those with the smallest sort of per capita percentage of free and reduced lunch. And so Greenville, Charleston, parts of Columbia, really our most populous, more suburban school districts at this point continue not to be, although I would expect in the next couple of years we'll see the General Assembly move in that direction. So why is investing in early childhood the way that South Carolina has an important thing? Sarah sort of went into this using a couple of bigger words than I'm going to. The issue here is, and she laid it out so nicely, 90% of brain development happens before the age of 5. Think about that. This is like building a house, right? If you have a strong foundation on which everything else is built, you're generally going to be in pretty good shape. Can you fix a foundation in your house when things go wrong after the fact? You can, but you know what? It's real costly, and it doesn't necessarily work as well, right? So, and that's sort of the same thing here. So investing during the time that this unique window of development is happening is awfully important. So we know this from a positive standpoint. We also know, looking at some South Carolina data, that we have good evidence now that adverse experiences during the first couple of years of a child's life tend to predict their failure by the third grade. And I know this is a real data-heavy table, so I'll give you kind of the cheat sheet here. The idea was, this was a study that Dr. Barron Holmes, who some of you may be aware of, he ran Kids Count for a number of years in South Carolina, helped us with several years back. What he did was he looked at a cohort of third grade students in South Carolina, and what he did was he pulled out those children who by the third grade fell into one of two categories of early school failure. First, he looked at kids who were too too old to be in the third grade. You know what that means, is that they have likely been retained in a grade level, so have in essence failed a grade level prior to getting to the third grade. He also then looked at the kids who were in the bottom 25% of the state standardized test. And we have a really unique opportunity and ability in South Carolina through what we call our data warehouse to look at some of the demographic figures. So Dr. Holmes was able to take these kids who were not performing up to par in third grade and was able to look backward in these children's lives to look at what were the risk factors that they faced during early childhood that might be predictive of them failing by the third grade. You see here on the far left a list of risk factors, any one of which gave these children statistically in South Carolina a 1 in 3 chance of falling into that failure by the third grade category. Up at the top, and these are the kids that Susan is certainly working with at DSS, children who are abused, neglected, placed into foster care. If you are placed into foster care, 53% of those children, by the time they reach the third grade, will have either been retained in South Carolina or will be in the bottom 25% in the state standardized test. So that's sort of how you can read this chart. As you see, there are a number of factors that relate to low birth weight, right, which is not surprising. We know that children who are born prematurely tend to lag developmentally and have some issues there. An awful lot of these, though, relate to poverty. Those kids who qualify for TANF benefits that Susan was talking about here just a few minutes ago, those are families that are at 50% or less of the federal poverty definition, which is, Susan, you probably could spout off the number better than I could, but we're talking about a single parent and a child who exist for a year on less than $10,000 roughly. Food stamps, or SNAP as it's now called, at 130% of poverty. But you see the impact in these figures that poverty plays in helping to shape and determine the long-term success of these kids, particularly during their early childhood years. Births to teenage mothers as well is a big factor on here as well. So Sarah sort of talked about this as well, but take a look. These lines show the neural connections, right? So we talked about having all of the brain cells, but making those connections between the cells. This shaded area that you see with this very high kind of prevalence of brain growth and those neural connections, that's during the first year of life. And if you look at those lines, those relate to sensory connections, to language, and to higher cognitive functions. It's really shocking in a way, to see this sort of data and to understand just how consequential the first year alone is, right? So all the more reason that we should be looking at how to invest. I don't think this has a laser pointer, but you can see there as we start to number out past the purple shading there, things in terms of those connections happening drop off very sharply, particularly after age 5. And so creating that good foundation early on is especially critical. This is the same graph Sarah mentioned that I was going to show it as well. I just want to emphasize once more how absolutely critical early language development is in shaping later cognitive function. These children that as they were able to assess, we're talking about a gap of 30 million words by age 3. Now, that's not a vocabulary, that's the words that the children have been exposed to. The vocabulary actually is some of what's listed out there in the boxes, but you can see, the children of professional families in this study, by 36 months, had more than twice the vocabulary of their lower income, less advantaged peers. Why does this matter? Have you ever tried to read something that was in a topic that you didn't understand? Have you ever tried? I'm sure Sarah used a word earlier that we probably all didn't understand, right? So if you read a medical journal, chances are good, if that's not something that you are steeped in, that you may be able to pronounce some of those words. You certainly won't comprehend them, and that's really what reading is all about. But it goes even more deep than reading. It gets really to the very way in which we think. The two different theorists have sort of posited this in different ways, but language after a certain point is more than just the content of what we can think. After a certain point in early childhood, language actually helps to form the structure of cognition itself, right? Try to think, as you are sitting, probably thinking this guy needs to hush and go sit down. You're doing it in words, right? So imagine how consequential this is. I mean, this early exposure to language not only is helping to shape what children are thinking, but literally is shaping how children are thinking, and I think that's awfully important. What we have found, though, generally from a public policy perspective, is that we are investing potentially at all the wrong times. What these two lines show are brain size by age. So you see that the blue line there shows that very rapid growth during the early years of life. The bottom line shows public investment by age, right? We tend to invest very, very little historically. Now, this is not South Carolina data. This is from a national study from several years back. But the gist of it is not so much that we look at numbers, but to understand. Think about how we make investments in children, right? We start sending them to public school. We start making those sizable investments now, maybe in some cases when they're 4, but generally from the time they're 5 until the time they're about 17, and then they go on to college. We pay lots and lots, and we invest lots and lots during a time of life after this very consequential period of brain development, which is something that I think we would be wise to look at carefully as a state. This is data from James Heckman, if that name sounds familiar. He is a Nobel laureate in economics. He works at the University of Chicago and has done a lot of modeling around the benefits of investing in early childhood. What you see here is sort of the declining return on investment, with the greatest rate of return being in programs that are serving very young children from the prenatal during that first year of life with that rapid brain development. Programs targeted toward the early years, having a very high return, preschool programs, and then eventually that return on investment dipping off as children get older. I keep saying to lawmakers, if I could tell you, if you could invest $1 with me and I could save you $6, $8, $10 later, would you want to do it? And the answer is always, in theory, yes. That's what we see here. Several of these landmark studies. The Abecedarian Project was a preschool study conducted at the University of North Carolina. Nurse-Family Partnership is an evidence-based program, a nurse home visitation program that you'll hear more about later in the evening. The Perry Preschool Project was a preschool study in Ypsilanti, Michigan, conducted back in the 1960s. They have now tracked the progress of those children, the life outcomes of those children for more than 40 years. What they have found is not only that those children who had a high-quality preschool experience achieved better educationally, but they achieved better in a whole host of life outcomes. They're more likely to be stably married. They're more likely to be homeowners. They're more likely not to have gone to prison. The list goes on and on and on. But you see the rate of return, that dotted line is sort of the dollar back for every dollar invested. We know that investing in programs for young children is a very cost-effective and actually something that stands to save taxpayers a good bit. So again, James Heckman talking about a 7 to 10% return on investment per annum. So a yearly return on that investment of 7 to 10% in all of those things. I know I've got just a moment or two. I want to tell you a little bit quickly about South Carolina First Steps to School Readiness. Again, we are the school readiness agency for the state. One of the things that we do through our state board and through our state office is help to underwrite a collection. There are 46 local nonprofit First Steps partnerships. So no matter what county you live in South Carolina, there is a local First Steps office. In fact, I don't know where'd Derek go. Wave, Derek. Oh, Derek's in the back. So Derek Lewis, who is our director of Greenville County First Steps, is here in the room, and somebody that you ought to seek out before the night is over to figure out how you might support. So those partnerships receive funding through the General Assembly and through private sources. They have the opportunity each year to do a needs and resources assessment and to propose how it is that they will fill gaps in early childhood services community by community. You probably know Greenville County has very different needs from Allendale County, has very different resources. And so it's a very localized model, but generally speaking, they support and help to underwrite programming in these 6 different lines of work. Health programs like Nurse-Family Partnership, family strengthening programs, parent education programs like Parents as Teachers, for example. Early intervention, we are the state lead agency for a program you may have heard of called BabyNet. It's the early childhood, early intervention program for infants and toddlers with disabilities and developmental delays. We work extensively with childcare, with early childhood kind of classroom-based preschool programs, and also you may have heard of Countdown to Kindergarten, which is a school transition program. We help to take high-risk, rising 5-year-old kindergartners and match them up with the person who is going to be their kindergarten teacher during the summer prior to kindergarten entry. It's been something that teachers have come back for year after year and really have talked about the benefit of seeing that. I think I've mentioned already most all of these, if not all of these, things that we do kind of from the state level. The 4K program, we're now serving about 2,500 kids in private settings. We are the state lead agency for Parents as Teachers, which is a wonderful evidence-based home visitation program. Since we're here at the Riley Institute, I will mention that we have been a runner-up in the Riley Institute's What Works South Carolina competition for, I think, 2 of the past 3 years with Parents as Teachers. Nurse-Family Partnership, again, you'll hear a little bit more about. We are the lead agency there. For BabyNet, we're also an early Head Start grantee. Oh, goodness, what happened to our graphic? Okay. Well, imagine, if you will, that in the center of this screen is a multicolored graphic that shows a child in the center. One of the things that we have worked on here most recently in collaboration with all of these partners that you see down at the bottom of the screen is a new description of school readiness for South Carolina. This is roughly a 2-page document that is designed to help parents and help the public and help other agency partners understand what it means to be ready for school in South Carolina. It includes information on the kinds of skills and abilities we would expect a child to have. But it also includes descriptions of how parents support this, how families support school readiness, how the community supports school readiness, and the important role that teachers and schools have in supporting school readiness as well. What this is all leading to is something that hopefully maybe looks a little bit familiar to you. Maybe you've seen some of these graphics around the state. As part of the launch of this school readiness description, we have launched a program called I Can, and the idea sort of goes back to that graphic that you couldn't see, and that is that everyone has a role to play in helping to support school readiness. It's not just a responsibility that vests within the child. It's something that parents can help to support. It's something that churches can help support. This is our board chairman, Ken Wingate, talking about one of the things he can do is he can read to his grandchildren. There are a series of billboards around the state that talk about some of the skills like making predictions as we read. So these are the kinds of things that we hope to get you involved with. One of the things that I think Jill had told us early on before we started was that frequently in these summer sessions, that one of the things that people want to know is how they can get involved. So I'll leave you with 2 suggestions. One, if you live in Greenville County, make sure you go visit Derek and see if, I'm sure he would be happy to take contributions or volunteer time or what have you. But definitely get involved at the local level. There is a local board in every county, so maybe a way you could contribute is getting involved in that local nonprofit board. The other thing, though, that you can do is as you leave here tonight, think about this I Can campaign and give some thought to what it is in your context that you can do. Sarah gave an example of the grocery store project. My friend Robin Reed's going to talk to you in a minute about Talk to Me, which is a new campaign. But that's a good example of like what what role do I as a grocery store manager play? What could I do to help to support school readiness? So it is a responsibility that we all share and an investment that is a really wise public policy one for South Carolina. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight.